Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because today Wayne continues to read Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Always remember that as we go through these amazing stories and read these outstanding adventures, all you have to do is press the CC button in your YouTube link in order to follow along with the words. Now I think that Bumblebee will be perfect to join us for today's adventure. Now the Bumblebee's here. Let's jump in. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Chapter 5, The Dementor. Tom woke Harry up the next morning with his usual toothless grin and cup of tea. Harry got dressed and was just persuading a disgruntled Hedwig back into her cage when Ron banged his way into the room, pulling his sweatshirt over his head and looking irritable. "The sooner we get on the train, the better," he said. "At least I can get away from Percy at Hogwarts. Now he's accusing me of dripping tea onto his photo of Penelope Quirrell, you know," Ron grimaced. "His girlfriend. She's hidden her face under the frame because her nose has gotten all blotchy. I've got to tell you something," he began. But they were interrupted by Fred and George, who looked in to congratulate Ron on infuriating Percy again. They headed down to breakfast, where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow. And Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny what a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All three of them were rather giggly. "What were you saying?" Ron asked as they sat down. "Later," Harry murmured, as Percy stormed in. Harry had no chance to speak to Ron or Hermione in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving their trunks down the heavy cauldron's narrow staircase and piling them into the door with Hedwig and Hermes. Percy's Screech Owl perched on top of the cages. A small wickerwork basket stood on the heap of the trunks, spitting loudly. "It's all right, Crookshanks," cooed Hermione at the wickerwork. "I'll let you out on the train." "You won't," snapped Ron. "What about poor Scabbers, eh?" He pointed to his chest with a lump indicated that Scabbers had curled up in his pocket. Mr. Weasley had been outside waiting for the ministry cars, stuck his head inside. "They're here," he said. "Harry, come on." Mr. Weasley marched Harry across the short stretch of pavement towards the first of the two fashioned green cars, each which was driven by a furtive-looking wizard wearing a suit of emerald velvet. "In you go, Harry," said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Harry got in the back of the car and was shortly joined by Hermione and Ron, and to Ron's disgust, Percy. The journey to King's Cross was very uneventful compared with Harry's trip on the night bus. The ministry cars seemed almost ordinary, though Harry noticed that they could slide through the gaps that Uncle Vernon's new company car certainly couldn't have managed. They reached King's Cross with 20 minutes to spare. The ministry drivers found them trolleys, unloaded their trunks, touched their hats to salute Mr. Weasley, and drove away, somehow managing to jump to the head of unmoving line at the traffic lights. Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way to the station. "Right then," he said, glancing around them. "Let's do this as pairs, as there are many of us. I'll go through with Harry." Mr. Weasley strolled towards the barrier between the platforms 9 and 10, pushing Harry's trolley and apparently very interested in Intercity 125 that had just arrived at platform 9. With a meaningful look at Harry, he leaned casually against the barrier. Harry imitated him. In a moment, they had fallen sideways through the solid metal onto platform 9 3/4 and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine, puffing smoke over the platform, packed with witches and wizards, seeing their children onto the train. Percy and Ginny suddenly appeared behind Harry. They were panting and apparently taking the barrier at a run. "Ah, there's Penelope," said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Ginny caught Harry's eye, and they both turned away to hide their laughter, as Percy strode over to a girl with long curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so she couldn't miss his shiny badge. Once the remaining Weasleys and Hermione had joined them, Harry and Ron led the way to the end of the train, past packed compartments, to a carriage that looked quite empty. They loaded the trunks onto it, stood Hedwig and Crookshanks in the luggage rack, and went outside to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, then Hermione, and finally Harry. He was embarrassed, but really quite pleased when she gave him an extra long hug. "Take care, won't you, Harry?" she said as she straightened up, her eyes oddly bright. Then she opened her enormous handbag and said, "I've made you all sandwiches. Here you are, Ron." "No, not corned beef. Fred? Where's Fred?" "Here you are, dear." "Harry," said Mr. Weasley quietly, "come over here a moment." He jerked his head towards a pillar. Harry followed him behind it, leaving the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. "There's something I've got to tell you before you leave," he said, Mr. Weasley in a tense voice. "It's all right, Mr. Weasley," he said. "I already know." "You know? How could you? I heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night. I couldn't help but hear it." And Harry added quickly, "Sorry, that's not the way I'd chosen for you to find out," said Mr. Weasley, looking anxiously. "No, honestly, it's okay. This way you haven't broken your word to Fudge, and I know what's going on. Harry, you must be very scared." "I'm not," said Harry sincerely. "Really," he added, because Mr. Weasley was looking disbelievingly. "I'm not trying to be a hero, but seriously, Sirius Black can't be worse than Voldemort, can he?" Mr. Weasley flinched at the sound of the name, but overlooked it. "Harry, I knew you were, well, made of stronger stuff than Fudge seems to think, but I'm obviously pleased that you're not scared. But Arthur," cried Mrs. Weasley, who was now shepherding the rest onto the train. "Arthur, what are you doing? It's about to go." "He's coming, Molly," said Mr. Weasley as he turned back to Harry and kept lower word. "Listen, I want you to give me your word." "That I'll be a good boy and stay in the castle," said Harry gloomily. "Not entirely," said Mr. Weasley, who looked more serious than Harry had ever seen him. "Harry, swear to me that you won't go looking for Black." Harry stated, "What?" There was a loud whistle. Guards were walking along the train, slamming the door shut. "Promise me," said Mr. Weasley, telling him quickly, "that whatever happens, why would I go looking for someone who wants to kill me?" said Harry blankly. "Swear to me that whatever you might hear—" "Arthur, quickly," said Mrs. Weasley. Steam was billowing from the train. It started to move. Harry ran to the compartment door and Ron threw it open and stood back to let him in. They leaned out the window and waved at Mr. and Mrs. Weasley until the train turned the corner and blocked them from view. "I need to talk to you in private," Harry muttered to Ron and Hermione as the train began to speed up. "Go eat, Jeannie," Ron said. "Oh, that's nice," said Jeannie huffily, and stalked off. Harry and Ron and Hermione sat down in the corridor looking for an empty compartment, but they were all full except for the one at the very end of the train. This had only one occupant, a man sitting fast asleep next to the window. Harry and Ron and Hermione looked at the threshold. Hogwarts Express was usually reserved for students, and they had never seen an adult there before, except for a witch who had pushed the food cart. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard robes that had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted, though quite young. His light brown hair was freckled with gray. "Who do you reckon he is?" Ron hissed, as they sat down and slid the door shut, taking the seats furthest away from the window. "Professor R.J. Lupin," whispered Hermione at once. "How do you know?" "It's on his case," she replied, pointing at the large luggage rack over the man's head, where there was a small, battered case held together with a large quantity of nearly knotted string. The name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across the corner in peeling letters. "Wonder what he teaches," said Ron, frowning at Professor Lupin's pallid profile. "That's obvious," whispered Hermione. "There's only one vacancy, isn't there? Defense against the dark arts." Harry, Ron, and Hermione had already had 2 Defense Against the Dark Arts, both of whom had lasted only 1 year. There were rumors that the job was jinxed. "Well, I hope he's up to it," said Ron doubtfully. "He looks like one good hex would finish him off, doesn't he?" Anyway, he turned to Harry. "What were you going to tell us?" Harry explained all about Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's argument and the warning Mr. Weasley had given him. When he had finished, Ron looked thunderstruck, and Hermione had her hands over her mouth. She finally lowered them to say, "Sirius Black escaped to come after you? Oh, Harry, you'll have to be really, really careful. Don't go looking for trouble, Harry." "I don't go looking for trouble," Harry nettled. "Trouble usually finds me." "How thick would Harry have to be to go looking for a nutter who wants to kill him?" said Ron shakily. They had taken the news worse than Harry had expected. Both Ron and Hermione seemed to be much more frightened of Black than he was. "No one knows how he got out of Azkaban," said Ron uncomfortably. "No one's ever done it before. And he was a top security prisoner, too." "But they'll catch him, won't they?" said Hermione earnestly. "I mean, they've got all the muggles out looking for him, too." "What's that noise?" said Ron suddenly. A faint soft of whistle was coming from somewhere. They looked around the compartment. "It's coming from your trunk, Harry," said Ron, standing up, reaching for the luggage rack. A moment later, he pulled the pocket sneakoscope out of Harry's robes. It was spinning very fast in the palm and going brilliantly. "That's a sneakoscope," said Hermione, standing up for a better look. "Yeah, mind you, it's a very cheap one," Ron said. "It went haywire just as I was trying it to Errol's leg to send it to Harry." "Were you doing anything untrustworthy at that time?" said Hermione shrewdly. "No, well, I wasn't supposed to be using Errol. You know he's not really up to long journeys. But anyhow, how else was I supposed to get Harry's present to him?" "Stick it back in the trunk," Harry advised as the sneakoscope whistled piercingly, "or I will wake him up." He nodded toward Professor Lupin. Ron stuffed the sneakoscope into a particularly horrible pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks, which deepened the sound, then closed the lid on the trunk. "We could get it checked in Hogsmeade," said Ron, sitting back down. "They sell all sort of thievish bandages, magical instruments and stuff. Fred and George told me." "Do you know much about Hogsmeade?" asked Hermione keenly. "I read it's the entire only non-Muggle settlement in Britain." "Yeah, I think it is," said Ron, in an offhand sort of way. "But that's the way they go. I just want to get inside Honeydukes." "What is that?" said Hermione. It's the sweet shop, said Ron, a dreamy look on his face. They've got everything. Pepper imps, they make you smoke at the mouth. They got fat chocolate balls full of strawberry mousse and clotted cream, and really excellent sugar quills, which you can suck on in class and just look like you're thinking what to write next. But Hogsmeade is an interesting place, isn't it, Hermione pressed on eagerly. In sites of historical sorcery, it says that the inn was the headquarters of the 1612 Goblin Rebellion, and the Shrieking Shack's supposed to be the most severely haunted building in Britain. The massive sherbet balls that make you levitate a few inches off the ground when you're sucking on them, said Ron, who was plainly not listening to a word Hermione was saying. Hermione looked around at Harry. Won't it be nice to get out of school for a bit and explore Hogsmeade? Expect it will, said Heavy heavily. You'll have to tell me about it when you found out. What do you mean, said Ron. I can't go. The Dursleys didn't sign my permission form, and Fudge wouldn't either. Ron looked horrified. You're not allowed to come, but... No way! McGonagall, someone will give you permission. Harry gave a hollow laugh. Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, was very strict. Or, we can ask Fred and George. They know the secret passage out of the castle. Ron, said Hermione sharply. I don't think Harry should be sneaking out of school with Sirius Black on the loose. Yeah, I'll expect that's what McGonagall will say when I ask for permission, Harry said bitterly. But if we're with him, said Ron, spirit leader Hermione, Black wouldn't dare. Oh, Ron, don't talk rubbish, snapped Hermione. Black's already murdered a whole bunch of people in the middle of a crowded street. You think he's going to worry about attacking Harry just because we're there? She was fumbling with the straps of Crookshank's blanket as she spoke. Don't let that thing out, Ron said, but too late. Crookshanks leapt out mightily at the basket, stretched yawned, and sprang onto Ron's knees. And the lump of Ron's pocket trembled, and he shoved Crookshanks angrily away. Get out of here! Ron, don't, said Hermione angrily. Ron was about to answer back when Lupin stirred. They watched him apprehensively, but he simply turned his head the other way, mouth openly, and slept on. The Hogwarts Express moved steadily north, and the scenery outside the window became wilder and darker, while the clouds overhead thickened. People were chasing backward and forward past the door of the compartment. Crookshanks had now settled on an empty seat, his squashed face turned toward Ron, his yellow eyes on Ron's top pocket. At 1 o'clock, the plump old witch in the food cart arrived at the compartment door. You think we should wake him? Ron asked awkwardly, nodding towards Professor Lupin. He looks like he could do with some food. Hermione approached Professor Lupin cautiously. Professor, excuse me, Professor. He didn't move. Don't worry, dear, said the witch as she handed Harry a large sack of Calton cakes. If he's hungry when he wakes up, I'll be up at the front with the driver. I suppose he is asleep, said Ron quietly, as the witch slid the compartment door closed. I mean, if he hasn't died, has he? No, he's breathing, whispered Hermione, taking the cauldron cake Harry had passed her. He might not be very good company, but Professor Lupin's presence in their compartment had its uses. Mid-afternoon, just as it started to rain, blurring the rolling hills outside the window, they heard footsteps in the corridor again, and their three least favorite people appeared at the door. Draco Malfoy, flanked by his cronies, Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle. Draco Malfoy had been enemies ever since they met on their very first train journey to Hogwarts. Malfoy had taken a pale, pointed, sneering face, was in Slytherin House. He played their seeker in the Slytherin Quidditch team, in the same position that Harry played on Gryffindor team. Crabbe and Goyle seemed to exist to do Malfoy's bidding. They were both very wide and muscular. Crabbe was taller with a pudding bowl haircut and a very thick neck. Goyle was short, bristling hair and long, gorilla-ish arms. Well, look who it is, said Malfoy in his usual lazy drawl, pulling open the compartment door. Potter and the Weasel. Crabbe and Goyle chuckled trollishly. I heard your father finally got his hand on some gold this summer, Weasley, said Malfoy. Did your mother die of shock? Ron stood up so quickly he knocked Crookshanks' basket to the floor. Professor Lupin gave a snort. Who's that? Said Malfoy, taking an automatic step backwards once he spotted Lupin. New teacher, said Harry, who had got to his feet too, in case he needed to hold Ron back. What were you saying, Malfoy? Malfoy's eyes narrowed. He wasn't fool enough to pick a fight under the nose of a teacher. Come on, he muttered resentfully to Crabbe and Goyle, and they disappeared. Harry and Ron sat down again, Ron massaging his knuckles. I'm not going to take any crap from Malfoy this year, he said, angrily. I mean it. If he makes one more crack about my family, I'm going to fold his head in. Ron made a violent gesture in the air. Ron, hissed Hermione, looking at Lupin. Be careful. But Lupin was still fast asleep. The rain thickened as the train sped further north. The windows were now solid shimmering gray, which gradually darkened until the lanterns flickered into life along the corridors and all over the luggage racks. The train rattled, The rain hammered and the wind roared, but still Professor Lupin slept. "We must nearly be there," said Ron, leaning forward to look past Lupin at the now completely black window. The words had hardly left him when the train started to slow down. "Great," said Ron, getting up and walking carefully past Lupin to try to see outside. "I'm starving. I want to get to the feast." "We can't be there," said Hermione, checking her watch. "So why are we stopping?" The train was getting slower and slower as the noise of the pistons fell away. The wind and rain sounded louder and louder, ever against the windows. Harry, who was nearest the door, got up to look in the corridor. All along the carriages, heads were sticking cautiously out of the compartments. The train came to a stop with a jolt. Distant thuds and bangs told them that the luggage had fallen out of the rocks. Then, without warning, all the lamps went out, and they were plunged in the total darkness. "What's going on?" said Ron's voice behind Harry. "Ouch!" gasped Hermione. "Ron, that's my foot." Harry felt his way back to his seat. "Do you think we've broken down?" "Dunno." There was a squeak sound, and Harry saw a dim black outline of Ron, wiping a patch clean on the window and peering out. "There's something moving out there," said Ron. "I think people are coming aboard." The compartment door suddenly opened, and someone fell painfully over Harry's legs. "Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Ouch, sorry." "Hello, Neville," said Harry, feeling around in the dark and pulling Neville up by his cloak. "Harry, is that you? What's happening?" "No idea. Sit down." There was a loud hissing sound and a yelp of pain. Neville had tried to sit on Crookshanks. "I'm going to go and ask the driver what's going on," came Hermione's voice. Harry felt her pass him, heard the door slide open, and then a thud of two loud squeals of pain. "Who's that? Ginny? Hermione? What's going on?" "I was looking for Ron." "Come in and sit down." "Not in here," said Harry hurriedly. "I'm here." "Out," said Neville. "Quiet!" said a hoarse voice suddenly. Professor Lupin had woken up at last. Harry could hear his movements in the corner. None of them spoke. There was a soft crackling noise, and a shivering light filled the compartment. Professor Lupin appeared to be holding a handful of flames. They illuminated his tired gray face, but his eyes looked alert and wary. "Stay where you are," he said in a hoarse voice, and he slowly got to his feet with his handful of fire held out in front of him. But the door slid open slowly before Lupin could reach it. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the shivering flames in Lupin's hand, was a cloaked figure that towered to the ceiling. Its face was completely hidden beneath his hood. Harry's eyes darted downward. What he saw made his stomach contract. There was a hand protruding from the cloak, and it was glistening grayish, slimy looking and scabbed, like something dead that was decayed in water. But it was visible only for a split second, as though the creature beneath the cloak sensed Harry's gaze and hand and suddenly withdrawn into the fold of its black cloak. Then the thing beneath the hood, whatever it was, drew a long, slow, rattling breath, as though it was trying to suck something more than air from their surroundings. An intense cold swept over them all. Harry felt his own breath catch his chest. The cold went deeper than his skin, and inside his chest, it was inside his very heart. Harry's eyes rolled up into his head. He couldn't see. He was drowning in cold. There was a rushing in his ears, as though the water, and he was being dragged downward, the roaring growing louder. And then, from far away, he heard screaming, terrified, pleading screamings. He wanted to help whoever it was. He tried to move his arms, but he couldn't. A thick white fog was swirling around him inside him. Harry, are you all right?" Someone was slapping his face. What? Harry opened his eyes. There were lanterns above him. The floor was shaking. The Hogwarts Express was moving again, and the lights were back on. He seemed to have slid out of his seat onto his floor. Ron and Hermione were leaning next to him, and above them he could see Neville and Professor Lupin watching. Harry felt sick. When he put his hand to put his glasses back on, he felt his cold sweat on his face. Ron and Hermione heaved him back onto his seat. "Are you okay?" Ron asked her nervously. "Yeah," said Harry, looking quietly towards the door. That hooded figure had vanished. "What happened? Where's that thing? Who screamed?" "No one screamed," said Ron, more nervously still. Harry looked around at the bright compartment. Ginny and Neville looked back at him, both very pale, but I heard screaming. A loud snap made them all jump. Lupin was breaking an enormous slab of chocolate into pieces. "Here," he said to Harry, handing him a particularly large piece. "Eat up. It'll help." Harry took the chocolate, but didn't eat it. "What was that thing?" he asked Lupin. "A Dementor," said Lupin, who was now giving chocolate to everyone else. "One of the Dementors of Azkaban." Everyone stared at him. Professor Lupin crumpled the empty chocolate wrapper and put it in his pocket. "Eat," he replied. "It'll help. I need to speak to the driver. Excuse me." He strolled past Harry and disappeared into the corridor. "Are you sure you're okay, Harry?" said Hermione, watching him anxiously. "I don't get it." What happened? Said Harry, wiping the sweat from his face. Well, that thing, the Dementor, it stood there and looked around. I think it did. I couldn't see his face. And Harry, and you. I thought you were having a fit or something, said Ron, who looked scared. You went sort of rigid and fell out of your seat and started twitching. And Professor Lupin stepped over you and walked towards the Dementor and pulled out his wand, said Hermione. And he said, none of us are hiding Sirius Black under our cloaks. Go! But the Dementor did not move, so Lupin muttered something, and the silvery thing shot out of his wand, and it turned around and sort of glided away. It was horrible, said Neville, in a higher voice than usual. Did you feel how cold it got when it came in? I felt weird, said Ron, shifting his shoulders uncomfortably, like I'd never be cheerful again. Ginny, who was huddled in her corner, looking as bad as Harry, gave a small sob. Hermione went over and put a comforting arm around her. But didn't any of you fall out of your seats? Harry said awkwardly. No, said Ron, looking anxiously at Harry again. Ginny was shaking like mad, though. He felt weak and shivery, as though he were recovering from a bad bout of the flu. He also felt the beginning of shame. Why had he gone to pieces like that when no one else had? Professor Lupin came back. He paused as he entered, looked around and said, with a small smile, I haven't poisoned the chocolate, you know. Harry took a bite, and to his great surprise, warmth spread suddenly to the tips of his fingers to his toes. We'll be at Hogwarts in 10 minutes, said Professor Lupin. Are you all right, Harry? Harry didn't ask how Professor Lupin knew his name. Fine, he muttered, embarrassed. They didn't talk much during the remainder of the journey. At long last, the train stopped at Hogsmeade Station, and there was a great scramble to get outside. Owls hooted, cats meowed, and Neville's pet toad croaked loudly from under his hat. It was freezing in the tiny platform. Rain was driving down in icy sheets. First years this way, called a familiar voice. Harry and Ron and Hermione turned and saw a gigantic outline of Hagrid at the end of the platform, beckoning the terrified-looking new students forward toward their new journey across the lake. All right, you three, Hagrid yelled over the crowd. They waved at him, but they had no chance to speak to him because the mass of people around them was shunting them away along the platform. Harry and Ron and Hermione followed the rest of the school along the platform and out onto the rough mud track, where at least 100 stagecoaches awaited the remaining students. Each pulled, Harry could only be assumed, by an invisible horse, because when they climbed inside and shut the door, the coach set off all by itself, bumping and swaying in procession. The coach smelled faintly of mold and straw. Harry felt better since the chocolate, but still weak. Ron and Hermione kept looking at him sideways, as though still frightened he might collapse again. As the carriage trundled towards a pair of magnificent wrought iron gates, flanked the stone columns towards the winged boars, Harry saw 2 more towering hooded Dementors standing guard on either side. A wave of cold sickness threatened to engulf him again. He leaned back into the lumpy seat and closed his eyes until they passed the gates. The carriage picked up speed on the long, sloping drive through the castle. Hermione was leaning out the tiny window, watching the many turrets and towers draw near. At last, the carriage swayed to a halt, and Hermione and Ron got out. As Harry stepped down, a drawling, delighted voice sounded in his ear. You fainted, Potter? Is Longbottom telling the truth? You actually fainted? Malfoy elbowed past Hermione to block Harry's way up the stone steps to the castle, his face gleeful and his pale eyes glistening maliciously. Shove off, Malfoy, said Ron. His jaw was clenched. Did you faint as well, Weasley, said Malfoy loudly. Did the scary old Dementor frighten you? Is there a problem? Said a mild voice. Professor Lupin had just gotten out of the next carriage. Malfoy gave Professor Lupin an insolent stare, which took in the patches of his robes and depleted the staircase. With a tiny hint of sarcasm in his voice, he said, Oh, Professor. Then he smirked at Crabbe and Goyle and led them up the stairs to the castle. Hermione prodded Ron in the back to make him hurry, and the 3 of them joined the crowd swarming up the steps through the giant oak doors into the cavernous entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches and housed the magnificent marble staircase that led to the upper floors. The door into the great hall stood open at the right. Harry followed the crowd towards it, but he had barely glimpsed the enchanted ceiling was black and cloudy tonight, when a voice called, Potter! Granger! I want to see you both! Harry and Hermione turned, surprised. Professor McGonagall, Transfiguration teacher and head of Gryffindor House, was calling over their heads. She was a stern-looking witch who wore her hair in a tight bun. Her sharp eyes were framed in spectacles. Harry fought his way over to her with a feeling of foreboding. Professor McGonagall had a way of making him feel he must have done something wrong. There's no need to look so worried. I just want to have a word with you in my office, she said. She told them, Move along there, Mr. Weasley. Ron stared as Professor McGonagall ushered Harry and Hermione away from the chattering crowd. They accompanied her across the entrance hall and up the marble staircase and along a corridor. Once they were in her office, a small room with a large welcoming fire, Professor McGonagall motioned Harry and Hermione to sit down. She settled herself behind her desk and said abruptly, "Professor Lupin sent an owl ahead to say that you were taken ill on the train, Potter." Before Potter could reply, there was a soft knock on the door, and Madame Pomfrey, the nurse, came bustling in. Harry felt himself going red in the face. It was bad enough that he passed out or whatever he'd done, without everyone making a fuss. "I'm fine," he said. "I don't need anything." "Oh, it's you, is it?" said Madame Pomfrey, ignoring this and bending down to stare at him consciously. "I suppose you've been doing something dangerous again." "It was a Dementor, Poppy," said Professor McGonagall. They exchanged a dark look, and Madame Pomfrey clucked disapprovingly. "Setting Dementors around the school," she muttered, pushing Harry's hair back and feeling his forehead. "He won't be the last one who collapses. Yes, he's all clammy. Terrible things they are, and the effect they have on people who are already delicate." "I'm not delicate," Harry said crossly. "Of course you're not," said Madame Pomfrey absentmindedly, now taking his pulse. "What does he need?" said Professor McGonagall crisply. "Bed rest? Should he perhaps spend the night in the hospital wing?" "I'm fine," said Harry, jumping up. The thought of what Draco Malfoy would say if he had to go to the hospital wing was torture. "Well, he should have some chocolate at the very least," said Madame Pomfrey, who was now trying to peer into Harry's eyes. "I've already had some," said Harry. "Professor Lupin gave me some. He gave it to all of us." "Did he now?" said Madame Pomfrey approvingly. "So he finally got a defense against the dark arts teacher who knows his remedies." "Are you sure you feel all right, Potter?" Professor McGonagall said sharply. "Yes," said Harry. "Very well. Kindly wait outside while I've got a quick word with Miss Granger about her course schedule. Then we can go down to the feast." Harry went back into the corridor with Madame Pomfrey, who left for the hospital wing, muttering to herself. He had to wait only a few minutes. Then Hermione emerged, looking very happy about something, followed by Professor McGonagall, and the three of them made their way back down the marble staircase to the Great Hall. It was a sea of pointed black hats. Each of the long house tables was lined with students, their faces glimmering by the light of 1,000 candles, which are floating over the tables in the mid-air. Professor Flitwick, who was a tiny little wizard with a shock of white hair, was carrying an ancient hat and a three-legged stool out to the hall. "Oh," said Hermione softly, "we've missed the sorting." New students at Hogwarts were sorted into houses by trying out a sorting hat, which sorted them into the houses they were best suited to: Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Slytherin. Professor McGonagall strode off toward the empty seat at the staff table, and Harry and Hermione set off in other directions, as quietly as possible, towards the Gryffindor table. People looked around at them as they passed along the back hall, and a few of them pointed at Harry. Had the story of him collapsing in front of the Dementor traveled that fast? He and Hermione sat down at either side of Ron, who had saved them seats. "What was that all about?" he muttered to Harry. Harry tried to explain in a whisper, but at that moment the headmaster stood up to speak, and he broke off. Professor Dumbledore, though very old, always gave an impression of great energy. He had several feet of long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, and an extremely crooked nose. He was often described as one of the greatest wizards of the age, but that wasn't why Harry respected him. You couldn't help trusting Albus Dumbledore, and Harry watched him beaming around at the students. He felt really calm for the first time since the Dementor had entered the train compartment. "Welcome," said Dumbledore, and the candlelight shimmered on his beard. "Welcome to another year at Hogwarts. I have a few things to say to you all. As one of them is very serious, I think it best to get it out of the way before you become befuddled by our excellent feast." Dumbledore cleared his throat and continued. "As you will be aware after their search of the Hogwarts Express, our school is presently playing host to some of the Dementors of Azkaban, who are here on Ministry of Magic business." He paused, and Harry remembered what Mr. Weasley had said about Dumbledore not being happy with the Dementors guarding the school. "They are stationed at every entrance to the ground," Dumbledore continued, "and while they are with us, I must make it plain to everyone that no one is to leave the school without permission. Dementors are not to be fooled by tricks or disguises, or even invisibility cloaks." He had added blandly, and Harry and Ron glanced at each other. "It is not in the nature of the Dementor to understand pleading or excuses. I therefore warn each and every one of you to give them no reason to harm you. I look to the prefects and our new school head boy and girl to make sure that no student runs afoul." Percy, who was sitting a few seats from Harry, puffed out his chest again and stared around impressively. Dumbledore paused again. He looked very seriously around the hall, and no one moved or said a sound. On a happier note, he continued, I am pleased to welcome 2 new teachers to our ranks this year. First, Professor Lupin, who has kindly consented to fill the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. There was some scattered, rather unenthusiastic applause. Only those who had been in the compartment on the train with Professor Lupin clapped hard, Harry among them. Professor Lupin looked particularly shabby next to all the other teachers in their best robe. "Look at Snape," Ron hissed in Harry's ear. Professor Snape, the potions master, was staring along the staff table at Professor Lupin. It was common knowledge that Snape wanted the Defense Against the Dark Arts job, but even Harry, who had hated Snape, was startled at the expression twisting in thin, shallow face. It was beyond anger. It was loathing. Harry knew that expression only too well. It was the look that Snape wore every time he set eyes on Harry. As to our second new appointment, Dumbledore continued, as the lukewarm applause for Professor Lupin died away. "Well, I am sorry to tell you that Professor Kettleburn, our Care for Magical Creatures teacher, retired at the end of last year in order to enjoy some more time with his remaining limbs. However, I am delightful to say that his place will be feared by none other than Rubeus Hagrid, who has agreed to take this teaching job in addition to his gamekeeping duties." Harry, Ron, and Hermione stared at each other, stunned. Then they joined with the applause, which was tumultuous at the Gryffindor table in particular. Harry leaned forward to see Hagrid, who was ruby red in the face and staring down at his enormous hands, his wide grin hidden in a tangle of his black beard. "We should have known," Ron roared, pounding the table. "Who else would have assigned us a biting book?" Harry, Ron, and Hermione were the last to stop clapping, and as Professor Dumbledore started to speak again, they saw that Hagrid was wiping eyes on the tablecloth. "Well, I think that's everything of importance," said Dumbledore. "Let the feast begin." The golden plates and goblets before them were filled suddenly with food and drink. Harry, suddenly ravenous, helped himself to everything he could reach and began to eat. It was a delicious feast. The hall echoed with talk and laughter, and clatter of knives and forks. Harry and Ron and Hermione, however, were eager for it to finish so they could talk to Hagrid. They knew how much being a teacher would mean to him. Hagrid wasn't a fully qualified wizard. He had been expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year for a crime he had not committed. It had been Harry, Ron, and Hermione who had cleared Hagrid's name last year. At long last, when the last morsels of pumpkin tart had melted from the golden platters, Dumbledore gave the word that it was time for them to go to bed, and they got their chance. "Congratulations," Hagrid squealed Hermione as they reached the teacher's table. "All down to you 3, said Hagrid, wiping his shiny face on his napkin as he looked at them. "Can't believe it. I mean, Dumbledore came right down to me hut after Professor Kettleburn said he had enough. And it's what I always wanted." Overcome with emotion, he buried his face in his napkin, and Professor McGonagall shooed them away. Harry, Ron, and Hermione joined the Gryffindor, streaming up the marble staircase, and very tired now, along more corridors, up more and more stairs, toward the hidden entrance of Gryffindor Tower. A large portrait of the fat lady in the pink dress asked them, "Password?" Coming through, Percy called from behind the crowd. "The new password's Fortuna Major." "Oh no," said Nova Longbottom sadly. He always had trouble remembering the passwords. Through the portrait hole and across the common room, the girls and boys divided towards their separate staircases. Harry climbed the spiral stair with no thought in his head except how glad he was to be back. They reached their familiar circular dormitory, with its 5 poster beds, and Harry, looking around, felt he was home at last. Oh wow, that was a really fun and chilling adventure with Harry and his friends. What do you think, Bumblebee? I'm excited for the next adventure too. We'll see you on the next time, okay? And we'll see you on the next time, here with Wayne Reads. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye!